Hi, everyone. I'm Paige Fortna. I'm the director of the Saltzman Institute. Really nice to see some familiar and not so familiar faces here at the Institute. We are thrilled today to have a book talk by Tobias, Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at Murdoch University in Perth, Australia. He's come a long way to tell us about his book. He's the author of numerous articles on climate and conflict and environmental peace building, and we'll be talking today about his brand new, hot off the presses book, Catastrophes, Confrontations, and Constraints. I love the alliteration. How disasters shape the dynamics of climate conflicts. And we are also very fortunate today to have as our moderator, Alex Sherbinin, who has gotten to the last couple of years of interdisciplinary climate stuff, workshops and networks and all kinds of things. Alex is a senior research scientist and deputy director at CIESIN. I always have to look up what CIESIN stands for. The Center for International Earth Science Information Network at the Climate School, and he's an expert on climate mobility and migration. And before I turn it over to Alex and Tobias, I think there's a small enough group that it would be great to go around the room and have people introduce yourselves and tell us your affiliation and sort of since you're
Hi everyone, my name is Africa. I'm from climate, from MBA in Climate Society program.
Hi everyone, I'm Josh Fisher. I direct one of the research centers at the Climate School focused on the intersection of peace, conflict, and sustainability. And I'm colleagues with many of you in this room. Yeah, thanks.
I'm Elizabeth Johnson. I'm an MA student in the history department in the International and World History program with LSE.
I'm Craig Hauser, local, that's interested in this topic and read the Times all the time.
I'm Adrian Kenyon. I'm a CIPA alum from the Penn State program, and I'm currently working with the Communications Department at Columbia Climate School.
Hi everyone, my name is Sonia. I'm a current master's student in the Human Rights program. My background is in gender-based violence and armed conflict. I'm looking at taking the climate change migration lens.
Hi everyone, I'm Saltzman. I'm from the CIESIN program.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Roberts. I'm an adjunct professor here and I'm affiliated with the Institute, and currently I'm teaching course on nuclear politics and strategies.
Jack Snyder, I teach international politics in the political science department, and right now I'm playing hooky from my office hours. So if I get an emergency text, I
not from the federal government, but students.
Yeah,
that's for a student.
I'm Sebratullah Ghaznari. I'm here at Saltzman Institute as a research scholar.
Hi, I'm David Koche. I'm an associate research scientist at CIESIN, and I work on the cause and consequences of migration.
Hi everyone, I'm Laure. I'm a French PhD visiting Columbia, and I'm more interested about innovation in the defense sector. That's why I'm here today.
Hi, I'm Olivia Grimberg. I'm the coordinator for the Saltzman Institute, one of the co-hosts of today's event along with the Climate School.
Great. So you've already heard my name, Alex Sherbinin, and I'm very pleased to introduce Tobias. Tobias reached out almost a year ago, I think. So he's very well organized, and I'm really looking forward to this talk because it's been A, a long time in coming, and B, a really fascinating topic. So we're really pleased to have him. While I'm introducing Tobias, we'll hear his talk, and then I'll try to coordinate a little bit and moderate discussion. If you have questions, just raise your hand and we'll get to them. So, Tobias, please take it away.
Yeah, very happy to do so. And I'm very happy for big thanks for the kind introduction and for having me here. It's a pleasure, and it's great to hear that we have so many different perspectives: history, climate, conflict, gender, which I also have a slide on. So I really try to hopefully deliver or present a bit for everyone. Before I start, I just want to, perhaps in a US context, it's worth mentioning that Murdoch University is named after Sir Walter Murdoch, the famous at least locally very famous West Australian intellectual, not the infamous media owner. So he doesn't sign the paychecks.
Just sort of moving back a little bit.
Yeah,
There we go, that way we can see.
all right, so I'm presenting the book, which is on catastrophes and conflicts. But the larger background is this driving research field on climate change and armed conflict, which the books and the whole project I'm presenting speaks to. And it also mentions quite well with climate school, obviously. So in case you're not coming from that field, climate change and conflict was a relatively minor field of research or practice until a few years back, but has now massively expanded. I think we had 5 debates in the UN Security Council since 2018. I just talked last week to the World Bank, who was increasingly going to be active in that space. Various UN agencies now mainstream climate change in their peace building and conflict prevention efforts, and so on and so on. And the focal point in these debates is quite often disasters emerging from natural hazards, such as droughts or floods, storms. And this is where the book kicks in, and it basically analyzes what happens if disasters, not just climate-related ones, all kind of disasters. What happens if disasters strike conflict zones? And if that issue rings a bell in the back of your head and not just the national security alert on your mobile or laptop, I'd say, yes, there was the big flood in eastern Libya, which is a civil war area, just 2 weeks ago. And there was the earthquake in Syria earlier this year. And there have been multiple droughts in the Horn of Africa, including Somalia. And there have been several cyclones in the Philippines, and there have been massive floods in Nigeria and in Pakistan last year, and so on and so on. So yes, disasters quite often intersect with conflict zones. And I argue that this is neither a coincidence, nor is this going to change in the next decades. So the reasons for this are on the left side that you see, and I'm not going into detail, that's basically a graphic of disaster events, disaster-related damage, and disaster-related deaths from 1980 to 2019. As you see, for most disaster types, for most disaster indicators, the trend is going up more or less steeply. And this is not surprising because climate change increases the risk or the severity of some disasters. We also know that urbanization and human mobility into vulnerable areas increases disaster risks. We are still living in a world with widespread poverty and persistent inequality, which makes people vulnerable to disasters. So we clearly see an upward trends in disasters. Then on your right side, you see that the number of active armed conflicts in any given year since the end of the Second World War. And up until 2015, until 2014, sorry, we only had 1 year with more than 50 armed conflicts worldwide. It was 1991 after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. But since 2015, actually each and every single year has seen more than 50 armed conflicts worldwide. So we're living in a period, even within the context of the last 70, 80 years of increasing domestic political instability, armed conflict, and civil war. So by sheer numbers, if disasters are trending upwards and conflict is pretty widespread, we should expect more disasters to strike conflict areas. And that adds to places with a history of violent conflict being more vulnerable to disasters because infrastructure is destroyed there. Usually funding or access for preparation is very limited. Trust in government is low, and so on. Yet, despite of this, there's actually very little research, both in disaster studies and peace and conflict studies, but also in the broader climate security field, on what happens when disasters strike armed conflict zones. We know we have quite a bunch of discussions about disasters and armed conflict onset, but not much really on basically the dynamics and the intensity of armed conflict. And this is where the project and the book kick in. So the project and the book basically have three main questions. So the first thing is, what happens once a disaster strikes an armed conflict area in terms of conflict intensity? Do the conflicts escalate or de-escalate in terms of the number of battles and the number of people that die in battles? The second thing is, what are the causal mechanisms that explain or that connect disasters to changes in conflict intensity? And the third question is, what are the relevant context factors that shape why in some places disasters have different impacts on conflict dynamics than on other places? And to do that, I compiled a sample of 36 cases of major disasters striking usually countries with an armed conflict, but I also usually zoom into the countries. And as you see, it's a pretty global sample. And then I use qualitative comparative analysis. I'm not going to talk too much about methods because that's always going to be a bit technical and boring for the audience, not too much into methods. But it's basically a method that is well suited to combine quantitative and qualitative data in a medium end setting such as mine. And it also means I can throw in quantitative data on disaster intensity, on battle deaths, on levels of human development, and combine them with more qualitative information I gathered through mostly desk-based studies and interviews. And this approach proved really fruitful because if you trust on quantitative data alone, for instance, 13 of the 36 cases would have coded wrong. So if you just checked how many battles and how many battle-related deaths we saw in the year after a disaster, then you would have just taken the upwards or downwards trends for face value, then 13 of the 36 cases would have been coded incorrectly, sorry. So that really demonstrates there is a value of this qualitative cross-checking of causal linkages and data. Before we talk about the results, let me briefly explain the theoretical framework of the study. And I know theory is usually not the most popular part of these kind of talks, but it's important to understand the results. So basically, the project and the book are interested in whether we see an escalation or de-escalation of conflicts after disaster, which is already expanding the literature, which usually only focuses on higher conflict risks rather than on lower conflict risks. So there's already quite a bit of extension there. Then it distinguishes between three possible explanations for changes in conflict intensity. Motivation, that refers to the motivation, the motives, the why groups that people are fighting. Strategy, which refers to the strategic environment and if you want to say so, material constraints or incentives that conflict parties face. And communication, which conceives violence as a form of sending a message to another conflict party or a broader audience, which I'll also discuss in a second. Then if you match these three explanations for changes in conflict intensity with the two potential outcomes, you have more or less six causal pathways. And I illustrate each one of them briefly with like one hypothetical example. So motivation and conflict de-escalation results in grievances. So that is basically if after a large-scale disaster, there are significant local grievances, for instance, because the government didn't prepare very well for the disaster or the aid was distributed in a very selective way, that could incentivize or that can lead rebel groups to intensify the fighting in order to cope up with the demands of their constituencies. They might also be able to get some more support from the local communities because there is so much also widespread anti-government resentment. However, we also know from long work in disaster sociology that right after disasters, there's usually more cooperation, trust, and solidarity at the very local level. That conflicts that existed before are sidelines, and there's a temporary surge in solidarity and cooperation. And just as I'm in New York, one of the classical examples is that murder rates in New York have gone down tremendously in the 3 months after 9/11. And we also know that quite often conflict dynamics are not just shaped by national level cleavages, but also by local dynamics and feuds and rivalries. So if disasters lead to an increase in local level solidarity, that could also mean there is less fighting at the local level between communities in the disaster affected areas. All right, the strategy perspective. Disasters on the one hand provide opportunities for conflict groups. For instance, if the rebels have a lot of their bases along the coast and it has been washed away by a coastal storm or tsunami, the rebels are weakened and the government could step up the conflict. But also likewise, the rebels group might recruit deprived disaster survivors as supporters or even into fighting roles, giving them an advantage and allowing them to escalate the conflict. However, in much the same way, disasters also provide constraints to conflict parties. It's really hard to move your troops around if all the roads have been destroyed by a flood or by an earthquake. It's really hard to feed your fighters and keep the logistics going if a drought undermines the local food supply. And then turning finally to the communication perspective. So costly signal, and here we really come to the main difference between strategy and communication. A strategy is more concerned with the material environment, and communication is more concerned with the non-material or communicative environment a group faces. So let's assume there is this rebel groups and its coastal basis has been washed away by a flood or a storm or a tsunami. That could lead some of the supporters of the rebel groups to believe that the rebel group is weak, that they will be too busy to recover from the disaster, that they lost too much equipment, fighters, perhaps also will. So they are not the right group to fight for their demands. They are perhaps not the group that the foreign government is going to support because they also don't have the impression, but they are a group the government perhaps wants to attack because they have been weakened by the disaster. Now, as a rebel group, you see it's pretty disadvantaged if there's an impression that you're weak. So you want to avoid that. How do you avoid that? Well, you can't tell that, no, we are still determined, we're still capable of fighting for the cause, because everyone knows you have selective incentives to lie about that. So if you stage a few attacks, become more active after the disaster, you send this costly signal. You're not just telling people, you're showing people that you're still capable and committed to fight. And that could drive a temporary surge in fighting intensity. But likewise, usually after a disaster, there's a lot of national and international attention, including media attention. Now, if you depend on local population or on international other governments to support you, well, perhaps you don't want to give the impression that you don't care about the local population and you continue fighting or you escalate fighting despite this massive amount of human misery and this human emergency going on. Rather, as both as a state, but also as a rebel group, perhaps you want to portray yourself as the responsible group, the group that scales down the conflict, that declares a ceasefire, that helps, that supports the relief efforts, that creates a safe environment for internationals to come in and deliver the aid, rather than to upscale the fighting, which means that strategically those groups might de-escalate the fighting to cultivate their image within internal and external audiences. Even so, they perhaps had incentives or opportunities to keep the fighting going. All right, so this is the theoretical framework. How does it all play out in practice? So first question, how do disasters shape conflict dynamics? And I have to say before I show the result, it was not purposeful sampling. It really came out as symmetric as it is, because it is very symmetric. So in half of all cases, disasters do not lead to any change in conflict dynamics, which obviously supports something that we already know, namely that political factors are usually the main drivers of conflict dynamics. However, in 9 of the cases, so that's pretty much exactly a quarter of the cases, we see the disaster triggering an escalation of the fighting in the 6 to 12 months after the disaster. So everyone concerned about climate change increasing conflict risks, we know already that's the case for onset in some contexts. In some contexts, yes, also disasters, including climate-related disasters, lead to an escalation of fighting. However, in another quarter of the cases, there's also a de-escalation of fighting after the disaster. There's a possibility that is rarely considered both theoretically and empirically, but it's actually rather widespread, at least in the sample I studied. But as it's a random medium M sample, and there's other cases outside of the sample, I have no reason to assume that it's not the case outside of the sample as well. All right, second question, which of our causal pathways have the best explanatory power? And as you will see, the strategy perspective is by far the strongest. So both within the escalation sample opportunity and in the de-escalation cases, the constraints explanation, they have the highest explanatory power. We see grievances and solidarity don't do tremendously well. This is not because there aren't a lot of grievances after disasters. This is also not because there isn't a lot of solidarity and cooperation after disaster, but that usually occurs in the form of local protests or small scale within community cooperation, which rarely translates up to a larger civil war or conflict level. Costly signal doesn't have much explanatory power. Image cultivation actually explains quite a few of the de-escalation cases, and it is particularly prevalent in cases of large-scale, high-intensity disasters, even in the sample that draw a lot of media attention, which is not surprising because if you want to cultivate your image, or that's the incentive for you, well, obviously you want a lot of people to look. Then it makes most sense to go down that pathway. Interestingly, in all of the opportunity cases, it was an opportunity for the rebel group. So it was always that the government has suffered from the disaster relative to the rebels, that rebels exploited that to escalate the fighting, at least temporarily. But here we know, for instance, from the case from the 2022 floods in Nigeria last year, that there's also cases where governments exploit rebel weakness after disasters. It just didn't happen within the sample. And as you see, enhanced recruitment opportunities and preoccupation of government forces with the disaster response are the most common mechanisms underlying this opportunity perspective. Appropriation and military mobility constraints to government forces happen rarely. All right, do I need to stop? Okay, when it comes to constraints that affect both rebel and government forces, it's usually financial troubles. Both the government but also rebels usually make when they tax local populations or they enforce any kind of other contributions if the local economy is in trouble from the disaster. Usually the rebels or the government groups suffer as well. There's reduced troop mobility and there's a reallocation of resources to the disaster response. Best example of that is the Taliban did not stage a big spring offensive in early 2020 because they devoted quite a few resources and fighters to the pandemic response. I'm not saying they did it very well. I'm not saying they are very nice guys. They had clearly strategic motives to do so. That said, they still felt they needed to devote some of the resources to the COVID response, which means they lacked manpower for the military offensive. The book also contains a chapter on COVID-19, but it's kind of a separate analysis. All right, so this is the same graph you saw before, just in a more arrowy way. And that helps me to answer the third question, specifically in which contexts do we see which of these dynamics play out. So first, I try to distinguish between cases where disasters had an impact on conflict dynamics versus where they didn't. And disasters had an impact on conflict dynamics if two conditions were present. The first one, a society is very vulnerable to disasters, which is indicated by things like high poverty rates, strong dependence on agriculture, and very, very bad preparations for the disaster, such as early warning systems. This is not too surprising, probably because as conflicts are mostly driven by political factors, for disaster to have an impact on conflict dynamics, it really has to have deep, far-reaching societal impacts, and that obviously happens most easily if a society is very vulnerable to disasters. And then the disaster needs to affect at least one conflict party, either directly or via its constituency. Quite often when disasters happen far away from the conflict areas, or like from the areas where the fighting is happening or where both conflict parties have their bases, so to say, usually conflict parties that are not affected, and then there's not much reason for them to react to the disaster. Escalate. Oh yeah. Now, secondly, when do in these settings, but when do the conflicts escalate? The armed conflicts escalate versus when do they de-escalate? The first one is escalation usually happens if the disaster benefits one conflict party over the other, and as I just said, it's usually the rebel groups. There's also a scenario in which rebels react to local grievances, or the local populations are not very happy with what happened during the disaster. They protest, there's more anti-government sentiment, and then the rebels pick that up, escalate the fighting, and the government is usually quite capable and fights back, and then the de-escalation just goes up. De-escalation happens if one conflict party is weakened by the disaster and the other is unable to exploit this weakness, either because it is affected by the disaster itself, or because it's a very small, very weak rebel group, or it's an area of the country where the state has very little control and very little troops stationed. So in the end, one conflict party has to de-escalate because it's weakened. The other one cannot exploit it to scale up its offensives. So we as a result, we see a de-escalation of the conflict. All right, let's give two very brief examples. There's 36 examples in the book, but I try to keep them brief. Sri Lanka had an ongoing conflict between the Liberation Front of the Tamil Tigers of Elam, the LTTE, and the government, going back all the way to the late 70s, early 80s. And in 2004, the country was struck by a massive tsunami, killing, I think this says 27-something thousand, but the graph is not really accurate. It should be killing around 35,000 people, wreaking massive destruction of coastal infrastructure, including in the northern and eastern areas where the LTTE rebels were basically controlling the territory. Now, the peace process that started in the early 2000s was already stalled, and there were already tensions between the conflict parties. But fighting was still pretty low at the time when this tsunami happened. And then after the tsunami, two things happened. So the first thing, there was a massive call out over the distribution of international aid. The government wanted to deliver the aid itself to the Tamil-controlled areas, which wasn't well received by the rebels for quite a few obvious reasons. The rebels wanted the internationals to deliver the aid directly to their areas so they could distribute it, which wasn't very well received by the government, of course. And that also resulted in initially very little aid flowing to the northeast. And that led to massive political fallout between the conflict parties, but also quite a bit of discontent on the local level. At the same time, both parties suffered to some degree from the tsunami, and the rebels were under the impression, perhaps not incorrectly, that the government was busy with the disaster response and repairing all the issues, all the destruction on the coast. So they would be weak and distracted. But the government assumed, given that the tsunami caused so much havoc in the Tamil areas, that the LTTE would also be weakened and busy with the disaster response and had some of their fighters killed. So they would also be weak. So both conflict parties thought that, well, if we escalate the conflict a bit now and gain some territory, do some military wins, then we can return to the negotiation table with a stronger position. But obviously, if both parties have this consideration, we see a massive escalation of the conflict, and that's exactly what happened. The counter to that is the 2010 floods in Pakistan, with almost 20% of the country's territory being underwater at some stage, caused several billions of dollars of US loss. And that happened during a time when Taliban was, when the Pakistani government was fighting a Taliban insurgency in the northern areas, which you can see were also affected by the flooding. And there were a lot of concerns by the international community, but also by academics, that the floods would basically weaken government control in some of the northern areas, lead to a lot of anti-government grievances, provide the insurgents some inroads to win hearts and minds by delivering relief, that it would actually escalate the conflict against the Pakistani government. But the contrary happened. In the first 12 months after the disaster, number of battles and battle-related deaths was cut in half. And that happened simply because both conflict parties were negatively affected by the disaster and could not cope up the fighting intensity as they did before. To start with, it's really hard to move your troops around if 20% of the country is underwater. It's really hard. Interestingly, terrorist attacks in urban areas did not decline, which is the part of the struggle by the Taliban that was least reliant on logistics. So you clearly see a logistical footprint in what kind of, and like the big battles, I mean, were almost zero in the first 6 months. So you really see the footprint of the disaster here. Also, both the government and military had to provide widespread disaster relief, evacuating people, clearing rubble, rebuilding roads and infrastructure. But also the Taliban, in the area that they controlled, they had strong bonds with the local population, so they felt sort of obliged to and delivered aid to the local population, which again cost them resources and manpower. They could also extract fewer funds from the local communities, simply because if all the assets have been flooded away, it's really hard to tax people without risking major discontent. So both parties were more or less busy with the disaster response, resulting in a temporary de-escalation of the conflict for the first 12 months. Then it researched again. There's this one case of Aceh after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami in Indonesia, where such a window of opportunity was actually used to start more long-lasting negotiations and really facilitate a peace agreement. But usually after the first 12 to 18 months, we see the conflict reverting back to normal after the disaster. All right, and then the final component of the project, which I just very recently finished, it's not in the book, it's a bit of the side papers you promised to under when you get funding, is on gender dynamics. And one of now I'm not going to talk about my initial hypotheses that were all wrong, and rather tell you about the ones that worked. You can ask about all the expectations I had that were absolutely not happening. So gender matters for these dynamics, and the only really stable pattern I found was that if rebel groups have a large share of female members in either combat or combat support roles, they are more likely to use opportunities related to disasters, and they are less likely to suffer from constraints related to disasters. And this is an interesting finding, but it actually resonates quite well with a large literature on women in civil wars and armed groups, which shows, for instance, that rebel groups with a large share of female members are really hard to defeat by government forces. Usually civil wars in which they are involved last much longer. And that is because drawing on female members offers various strategic opportunities and advantages for rebel groups, including, for instance, that if you recruit men and women, you have by sheer mathematics a 50% larger base across which you can recruit. And if you don't have 100 well-qualified, very willing recruits showing up at your secret base every day, recruiting enough members is an issue with rebel groups. We also know that in most cultural contexts, female fighters are perceived less threatening by local populations. So they are usually better to establish networks with the local communities, which is something rebels can then use if they want to get food, donations, or just intelligence after a major disaster. And the good comparison here is, and that's the two examples I just mentioned. The left is a picture of the LTTE female soldiers or female rebel members in Sri Lanka. And the LTTE has a history of at time periods when they had intense military battles with the government and they lost a lot of their fighters, quickly recruit female soldiers to basically fill the ranks. And I mean, we can discuss whether that's very ethical to do, but it's very effective that if you lose a lot of your male fighters, you quickly recruit a number of females that you already started training, started approaching before, which means that conveniently, if a large tsunami killed a lot or several of your male fighters, and you still want to engage in an offensive against the government because it's weakened, well, it's not too inconvenient. You can rely on a few more females to fill the ranks, stage the offensives, reach out to the local civilian populations, or just stay in the camps and repair them while someone else is doing the fighting. It's really a manpower issue. Taliban in 2010 in Pakistan, for instance, I mean, they're notorious for not having a lot of female members, wouldn't really suit their ideology. So they couldn't rely on women to forge connections with the local population. They couldn't rely on women to do intelligence because usually women are also usually less suspicious in the eyes of security forces. So if you want to smuggle supplies around, weapons around, information around, gather intelligence, especially in conservative societies like Pakistan, women are a good resource to do that. But if you don't have female members, well, you can't really do that. And you suffer much more from the disasters and are less capable as a rebel group to use the opportunities. All right, if you haven't bought the book already, if you use the Read MIT 15 code, you get 50% of the physical copy if you agree to the TOCs and have a US mail address. I was told by MIT to make it quite explicit. But MIT also made the book available open as access, so you can download a copy of the whole book as PDF online. If you're not into the mood of reading a whole book because you don't have a lot of time, I recently summarized the main insights from the project in international security, specifically on the climate conflict debate. So that's basically the discussion that brings this book, which also includes earthquake and tsunamis, and takes it really to the climate security field. And the article on gender and rebel group composition was just published a month ago in Global Studies Quarterly. So that's also there. And it's all open access, so you can all download it for free as well. All right, key takeaway points from one of my favorite hiking spots in Western Australia, by the way. All right, so disasters indeed increase conflict risks in some contexts, including climate-related disasters. So yes, if we talk about climate change and security risks, armed conflict intensity and armed conflict escalations is definitely one of the risks to consider. However, these links are non-deterministic. Half of the cases, no impact at all on disasters on conflict dynamics. And more importantly, perhaps they are multidirectional. We also see that conflicts de-escalate sometimes after disasters. And we know from a well-established literature in conflict studies, actually, that peace negotiations, brokering agreements is more promising during periods of low conflict intensity because peace spoilers are less active, which means disasters might well also provide windows of opportunity for renewed diplomacy, or at the very least for safe aid delivery if conflict intensity goes down. Conversely, if conflict escalation goes up, international donors or aid agencies would really need to be concerned about the safety of their staff not being caught in the crossfire. Opportunity and opportunity and constraints, so the strategy perspectives is the key mechanism. Communication plays a role for very large scale disasters that de-escalate, that draw a lot of media attention, where we sometimes see de-escalation of fighting, so because the conflict parties wanted to cultivate the image. Short-term power shifts matter. So it's usually how does the disaster on a really short-term affect the conflict parties differently, and how does shape their incentives and opportunities to escalate and de-escalate violence. And I feel that's a really important intervention in particularly the broader climate security, but also more narrow disaster conflict debate, because a lot of the research there is really focused on more structural factors like agricultural dependence, poverty, political system that rarely change over longer periods of times. But these, how do the disaster impact conflict dynamics in the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months after the disaster? And how does it affect the conflict parties? It really has a lot of explanatory power, and it so far largely went unexamined. And finally, I argue that these findings are applicable to a range of other external shocks. There is a chapter on COVID in the book. There's also a separate paper on COVID, where several of the findings are broadly similar to the ones on other kinds of disasters. But we also see very similar dynamics for instance, after global economic shocks or after rapid falls or rises of commodity prices, which can sometimes have very similar impacts in terms of opportunities and constraints to conflict parties that have disasters. With that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the questions and debate.
Great. Well, that was a very clear presentation, so I'm sure there's some interest here. So why don't you go ahead, Zach?
I was interested in your results on the Sri Lankan case, which struck me as counterintuitive in some respects. So you would think that each of the two parties would have lots of private information about the really dire effects of the tsunami on their own operations and capabilities, making them like pessimistic about how well they would do. But you would think that they would have less information about the impact on the other side. And most conflict pairs, you as a default, you would expect kind of worst case analysis. We know that we're doing very badly here from the tsunami, but the other guys, we're not sure. We better be really careful that they're not really strong and going to take advantage of us. But it turns out to be the opposite of that. And so I was wondering why.
All right. Shall we collect questions, or shall I address one-on-one?
I think we can go ahead and take a few ones in there.
All right. Two possible explanations. The first one, there was also this, Sri Lanka is one of the cases where grievances also played a role. There was a massive political fallout about the disaster relief. And in a situation where the peace negotiations had already been stalled and both sides were pessimistic about the opportunity that there could be a negotiated outcome, and there's massive short-term spike in unhappiness and grievances about the aid distribution. Even rational conflict parties might be a bit less risk averse and more willing to take the risk. But from what I read and heard from people involved in the case, that, I mean, both parties were actually confident that they were better able to withstand the tsunami impacts compared to the counterparts. So there was confidence on both sides that they were actually the ones who would benefit from the situation, or who were less badly affected.
Yes, go ahead.
A question about the same Sri Lankan case. Did you see that the geographical distribution of population of the Sinhalese, which were mainly government and Tamils mostly in the north, did that play a role? Because the capital is on the southern side of Sri Lanka, probably the government side was not much affected, and Tamils, the fighters, were more affected. Did that come up as a relevant factor?
I mean, I have to admit, I don't remember especially. I usually did check like the subnational changes in fighting patterns. I can't recount anything significant like it turned out in Sri Lanka. It was mostly a national level effect, which might be because fighting did not really take place across all the affected coastal areas. But rather basically at the front lines of the LTTE and government controlled territory. So I didn't, and I mean their escalation, you see the escalation because both conflict parties tried to gain some ground, but at that stage it was really more of within the contested areas, or areas where control was less firmly established, rather than linked to the geographical impacts of the tsunami.
Yeah, Paige.
Thank you so much, Tobias. It's a really interesting talk. One of the things I quite like about this project is that if you'd taken just a very sort of superficial look at this, you know, one might conclude there's no effect whatsoever. Half the time there's no effect. When there is an effect, it's as likely to go one way or the other, and sort of ended there, right? Okay, disasters don't affect the dynamics of conflict, but instead you go into these conditional kind of conditional effects, and when it should have no effect, when it should escalate, and when it should de-escalate. But I have several questions because I found this book really fascinating. So one of them is kind of about the choice of the dependent variable, about looking at escalation and de-escalation in terms of deaths, as opposed to say the probability that the war ends, or the length of time until the war ends, which sometimes in the book seems like what you're really thinking about, sort of, is this helping us get to peace or making it harder to get to peace? But sometimes we see escalations just before we get a peace deal, and often when we have, you know, low-level conflicts that grind on for a long time, that's consistent with a war that lasts for a really long time. So I'm curious if you have thought about that, and if you think that the findings about escalation and de-escalation would be similar if you were looking at the effect on, you know, sort of the risk of the war ending, or like a duration analysis kind of. So that's one question. A second one is also a little bit methodological, I think, which is about the use of the QCA analysis. And as you say, these relationships are not deterministic; they're probabilistic. But QCA is really about trying to find like necessary and sufficient causes and combinations. So I wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about why that method and how you think it fits with kind of probabilistic relationships. And then towards the end of the book, you talk about bargaining theory, and that comes through a little bit in other places too, but the framework that you set up about opportunity and constraints and grievances and communication is not incompatible with bargaining theory, but it's pretty different from bargaining theory. So I wanted to ask you about that kind of choice of that theoretical framework as opposed to a bargaining theory framework. And then a final question, which is kind of a question I have for this whole field and for myself as well, but I would love your take on it as somebody who's been working in this realm for much longer than I have, is how should we think about doing research on the effects of climate change when like we ain't seen nothing yet, right? So this is about sort of the scale of the disasters that we're seeing, scale and frequency of the disasters we're seeing so far have had certain effects, but we need to think about what that will be like in the future when we will be in unprecedented water. So without a crystal ball, how do we do this? And I know that's an impossible question to answer, but I'd love your thoughts on how you think about it as a researcher in this space.
All right, that's quite a good list of questions. All right, so about the dependent variable. I mean, I would frame it as a bit of, are you interested in intensity versus duration of the conflict? And the project was, I mean, I specifically thought it would be worth going on intensity because there has been some stuff on duration, not a whole lot. So there would have been another gap. But I was really interested in, I mean, in the end, it's funded by, I think in the US, it would be a national science grant. So the government, so in Australia, this need to really go, okay, what's in for us? So my selling point was, well, if there's a big disaster, you might send in aid, you might have nationals on the ground delivering aid, so you really need to understand what happens short term. So there was basically this overlap between the policy or the justification from a policy perspective and a clear research gap. I'm definitely was, and there's a study by, and interestingly, but I mean, there very little we know about duration. It's quite interesting. It goes in a similar direction. So there's a paper by CIESIN on disasters and conflict duration, which shows that in particularly disaster affected areas, conflicts on average last longer. But there's also a paper by, forgot the name. It's two authors, Global Study, International Studies Quarterly 2021, who find that if rebel groups depend on natural resources and the resource extraction area has been struck by a disaster, conflict is more likely to end because the rebels suffer from the impact. It's by some people they did do a James Walsh data set, but it's not one of the people of his group. So there is a bit of similarity, but I treat them as different outcomes or dependent variables. QCA, I mean, yes, QCA language is pretty much about necessary and sufficient conditions, and what I discussed here is mostly in terms of what the sufficiency analysis found. I usually, in the presentation for broader audiences, do not go too much into QCA because then you need to start with set theories and quasi-sufficiency and quasi-necessity. But I think QCA was quite well fitted for that project because QCA has a few assumptions built in that make it really, I mean, not so much the necessity and sufficiency that didn't really, I mean, that's built in, but I was mostly looking at the sufficiency. That was what I was interested in. But QCA is more interested, I mean, is built in that you can like use quantitative and qualitative data in one analysis with this calibration process. It's really good in discovering causal pathways. So basically you have an outcome, then you have different combinations of conditions that are present or absent to cause that outcome. And it's also open for, it's also very open for basically connecting pathways to an outcome, but also then to the absence or the other outcome like escalation, de-escalation. So that's why I went for that method. It's also very convenient to use in a medium N sample. I didn't want to go large N because they would have constraints on what I could find out on the local short-term qualitative dynamics and what I could basically what I could find out about the causal mechanism, but I also didn't want to do only 2 or 3 in-depth case studies because it would have caused issues about external validity. So QCA was a good middle pathway to do that. Bargaining theory. Yes, I mean, I think it shines a bit through. There's this, if disasters affect both conflict parties, or one is really suffered a lot from the disaster, the other is weak anyway, it might cause a bit of exhaustion, which increases incentives for conflict parties to bargain. So indeed, it's a bit of a background, but it's not really core to that framework. And I'm very happy to talk more about how bargaining theory could inspire the framework a bit stronger, how it can be extended. I didn't really thought about that specific direction a lot. And then climate change and conflict research. I mean, that's impossible to answer. I mean, what I'd say is, I mean, it's mostly disasters that cause more than 1,000 fatalities. And there's 5 with less than 1,000 fatalities, but they still have very, very severe impacts. So the challenge for climate conflict research, I'd say, is not necessarily that we're going into events that we've never ever seen before. I mean, a lot of these events with 70, 80,000 deaths, some of them storms. I mean, that's as intense as we will perhaps see the intensity in the next 50 to 100 years. The real challenge is, first of all, what happens if these events do not become no longer one in 100 years events, but 1 in 10 or 1 in 5 year events, and you have them back to back to back. So the recovery is not really finished, and then you have the next disaster. And that speaks a bit to if there's low levels of human development and high levels of disaster vulnerability, we see conflicts are more like dynamics. Disasters impact conflict dynamics, and certainly several disasters happening in short sequence to each other increase that vulnerability. The second thing is, and that's even harder to address, and I don't really have an answer for that, is that, I mean, at the moment, if there's a big drought in one country, usually there's a lot of international food aid coming in. If there's a big, I mean, that's a region where I'm working on, if there's a big disaster in Southeast Asia or the Pacific, usually Australia sends in the military to deliver goods. Now, what happens if these disasters not only happen much closer to each other, but if they happen more frequently at different places? And there's less international aid coming in because some of the donor countries or some of the countries that deliver to international food markets are suffering from droughts themselves. Or Australia has major bushfires and floods, so it can no longer send its militaries abroad to do the disaster aid. And that would obviously make the impacts of disasters on the ground much more severe. And this, I mean, that's really hard to assess based on past evidence. I'd say they were really going into unknown waters. And in that respect, I mean, the research is basically looking into the past to see what's happening in the future. It's a bit like linear in that sense, that it's really hard to predict what happens if the system is fundamentally changed.
You go ahead, I'll take one after that.
Yeah, quick question. I was wondering a bit about the selection criteria for inclusions of the disaster list, and you have half of the sample is basically cases where you see no effects, either on you suggest either linked to the size, the geography of the disasters, or the fact that both are affected in the same magnitude. But I was wondering about and sorry, it seems my question just slipped out of my mind just a second. Yeah, I'm a bit jet lagged. I came back yesterday, so I need a minute.
Shall I start? Shall I start answering the first question, then perhaps yeah, you can ask the second one. Selection of cases. I mean, not really very fancy. I just went to the MDET, the International Emergency Event Database, specifies, asked it for a list of disasters related to natural hazards, sorted it by fatalities or casualties, and then went down the list and said, did that country had a civil war and armed conflict at that time using the UCDP database. I capped the number of cases per country to 4, usually the 4 biggest disasters, because otherwise India and Philippines would be all over the place because they have so much conflict and so many disasters. And then I added 5 conflicts because droughts were quite underrepresented, and Africa and Latin America were a bit underrepresented, among others due to reporting criteria. So I basically went down the list and looked for potential cases and then checked whether they had really severe impacts locally that had less than 1,000 deaths to add a bit of geographical and disaster type variety into the sample.
Yeah.
But results hold if you focus on the 31 cases with 1,000+ deaths.
Okay, that's interesting. But yeah, I got my question, sorry. So yeah, one of the question you cite is, this is due to vulnerability. So some countries are vulnerable. Yeah, people mentioned 3 criteria, like size of the agricultural sectors, ability to respond. But we know that conflict that decrease significantly early warning systems, make it hard for government and different actors to respond. So how do you deal with this heterogeneity in some sense between both conflict and the disaster impact? So yeah, that the fact you have a conflict in the first place is likely to make it much harder for it's likely to magnify the impact of the disaster in some way. Yeah. But trying to understand a little bit. So what are those countries that are vulnerable in your samples, and how? So if we have a disaster that struck during the trouble in Northern Ireland, would we see there some effect on the British ability to operate their counterinsurgencies operations? Would we, or rather, are they kind of able to withstand this impact? I was trying a bit understanding how this difference between conflict and vulnerability. So.
All of the cases suffered from an already ongoing armed conflict, which means they had a history of armed conflict, which means they were, and that in some of the cases they heavily affected their disaster vulnerability. But some countries were able to deal with those quite well, either because the conflicts were relatively small scale, because the country was rich, because they still were able to implement good disaster preparation mechanisms. So take, for instance, Iran. So there are two cases in the sample, big earthquakes in Iran. But Iran is a country that usually, compared to other countries, prepares quite well for earthquakes, that has a higher amount of building standard enforcements, that is relatively rich, that has, especially compared to the rebel groups, a relatively strong military capable of clearing the rumble and looking for survivors quite well. That usually has, Iran has quite big departments of disaster studies and universities, so they have pool of qualified personnel entering into disaster preparation and response efforts. So some of the states, and my assumption would be that would apply to the UK as well. Despite being a conflict, despite having conflicts, are much better able to prepare for disasters than others. You want to do this?
Yes, thank you. So I have 2 questions. So I'm a student in conflict resolution, and I was wondering first, would you say that, like, from the practical side, like academic work isn't taken into account enough by, for example, UN peacekeeping operation? Because, for example, if you know that there's a clear link between disaster and, for example, escalation of conflict, would the UN peacekeeping operation in Libya would have done more effort to protect them so that it wouldn't break, so that maybe conflict would escalate? And so I was wondering whether the link between academia and real peacekeeping operation is already made, or is it something that is ongoing on?
It's emerging. So several UN peacebuilding missions have at least climate security advisors now. Many US UN peacebuilding missions, at latest since 2010, care more about infrastructure and environmental impacts. So I'd say it's creeping in, especially when it comes to the disaster preparation and response space. I haven't seen or heard a lot about UN peacebuilding missions taking that into account. They're more interested in environmental impacts and then like water supplies, resource conflicts, resource management, not so much in the disaster realm, except for with a partial exception of droughts. Droughts sometimes figure in. So I feel there's a growing trend into that, but it's only been really been going on for the last decade or so. So there's a lot of work still to be done.
Okay, thanks. And my second question is kind of weird, but like, would you say that armed groups, are they aware that climate change could benefit their fights and then like use it preemptively to like get like bigger and with more strength?
Not specifically about climate change. So you can ask me that question in a few weeks. Later this year, I'll be doing field research on disaster governance by rebel groups in the Philippines and Nepal. So that's where I'm going to ask specific questions about climate change and whether climate change plays a role for them as well. But I mean, especially in disaster-prone cases or countries or regions, rebel groups are familiar with the concept of disasters, and whether or not they attribute it to climate change, they know it poses challenges to them. So for instance, in countries like Egypt or Pakistan or Afghanistan, Islamist groups, be them insurgents or in power, have a tradition of responding to disasters on the local level, being actually some of the first to respond, using that as a way to build a relationship with the local population, but also devoting resources away from the struggle for that. I mean, they're obviously aware that it happened in the past, that it will happen in the future again. Likewise, in the Philippines, we've seen cases where the rebels have been very, very always, with each cyclone, with each earthquake, with each volcanic eruption that happens in an area or happened in an area where rebel groups, especially the Islamist groups, but also the communists, have some form of territorial control. They are always very, very that the government moves in, delivers the aid, and uses that to spy on them. And to spy on, basically win the hearts of the minds of the population back, but also to recruit local informants or just gather information in other ways. And they try to prevent it by sometimes attacking convoys, by closing off the areas, and so on. So yes, rebel groups are very much aware that disasters can and do happen in their areas, and they adapt to that strategically.
So I'll take chair's prerogative, ask maybe one last couple of questions, and then I think we can hang up Tobias, and anyone who wants to hang out afterwards and meet him personally, I'm sure he'll be willing to take some personal time. So one question I have was, you mentioned 13 of the 36 cases would have been miscoded if you had not conducted the more qualitative interviews and things. So in other words, it suggested to me that there was going to be either an uptick or downtick, that the numbers, uptick or downtick in numbers of fatalities in the following year, or was it 2 years or 3 years? That's what I don't actually know, but 1 year. And which cases were those, and kind of why did the qualitative research disprove it? The other gets a little, well, I had a slight question about mediating parties and whether mediating parties see advantages in, you know, with the international attention and suddenly people focusing on a particular area, whether there's some advantage to the mediators to be, you know, take advantage of the renewed attention to try to bring closure to longstanding grievances. The third question has to do with kind of this more complicated long-term relationship of disasters and disaster relief and conflict and grievances that lead to conflicts. So I was thinking, as you were talking about the case of Mali and the Tuareg in the north, and how they had become, what I understand, pretty disaffected by the central government because of droughts. It went back to the 1970s and 1980s that really were decades old. But by 2010 or 12, when there was a coup, they took advantage of that to basically, with Libyan arms, to basically try to wrest control of the northern parts of the country. And to me, this suggests that there's actually these really complicated two-way dynamics that Fabian was probably getting into a little bit, that it's sometimes the disaster itself can precipitate in responses by the government to the disasters can precipitate conflict, that the conflicts themselves leave countries very vulnerable. I'm sorry, that the conflicts leave countries vulnerable and at risk to increased numbers of fatalities, and so it's actually a rather complicated intertwined issue that you're looking at.
Yes, okay. I mean, yes, that they are closely intertwined. I mean, conflict make countries more vulnerable to disasters. But then I mean, the book really focuses on says, okay, we already have a country that is, I mean, they are all quite vulnerable. If they're not vulnerable, they wouldn't see disasters with thousands of fatalities. I mean, that's an indicator. I mean, similar earthquakes, even with Iran, which prepares quite well, similar size earthquakes kill a fraction of the population than they do in Japan, for instance. Even so, Japan is much more densely settled. So they are all sort of vulnerable to disasters. They are all sort of conflict affected. But then the question is, how do differences, particularly in disaster vulnerability, but also past conflict dynamics, how do they shape what a disaster does in the next 12 months? That's really the focus of the book, and let's say that part of the vicious cycle I try to try to analyze.
Narrow the focus.
I had a talk last week with the World Bank. We saw that I would planning to do a similar study on the reverse thing. So why do disasters have massive impacts on conflicts in some cases, but not in others? But it was more, hey, do you plan to do it anyway? And I'm like, I don't have a lot of funding for that. And they say, no, neither we do, but just because they're asking. So I mean, yes, I mean, that would be interesting. I mean, the other thing is some of the disaster responses are not just the disasters, but the responses are quite conflictive on another level. Talking about Sri Lanka, for instance, you have these coastal areas, particularly in the south, which are very, very beautiful, like in terms of which are basically fishing tracks, and which international tourism developers wanted to have for quite a while, but couldn't get hold of it. So then afterwards, the government declared a 200-meter no settlement. So I think it was more in some cases an 800-meter a non-settlement zone where you could only settle with special permit by the government. So all the fisheries could not rebuild there, but were settled inland, had to go longer distances. Then 2 or 3 years later, it was all sold to international developers to build resorts there. So you have a beach view. And not the shady fisherman view. 30 of the 36 cases. All right. I mean, now you're really asking me to dig into the data. So
Well, you don't have to give the specific, but it just sounded like you had quantitative data that said something different than what you then concluded as a result of these more qualitative interviews.
Yes. So yes, I did that. So I mean, these were usually, that's what you can easily get from the literature. Usually, like these are high intensity conflicts. They're quite well documented. On all of them, there's a good literature that basically traces the development of the conflict and when they escalate, when they de-escalate. So it's pretty. I mean, it's labor intensive, but it's pretty possible to triangulate. So Pakistan. That's not a good example, is it?
But was it
anyway? I'm not going
into this. A two-finger question. So is it that when you did the qualitative work, you saw that the quantitative numbers of people dying of battle deaths, say, was wrong, and therefore it didn't qualify as an escalation or de-escalation? Or was it that when you did the qualitative work, you saw that there was that escalation or de-escalation, but it was coincidental? It didn't actually have anything to do with
both. So in some cases, I mean, I checked. I mean, actually 3. So sometimes there were just numbers did not exactly add up to what was happening in the literature. Sometimes the number indicated a trend, but it was driven by completely different parts of the country. It had nothing to do with the disaster. It was not related to not in the disaster area. Or it happened, but it was not related to the disaster at all. So I remember I think Pakistan 2005 had a quite heavy escalation of the fighting in the disaster affected area. but it was the government already decided on the offensive 3 months before the disaster. Prepared the offensive, gathered the troops. Then the disaster happened, they postponed it for a month or so, and then they went all out, but it was already decided and planned and coordinated all before, had nothing to do with the disaster. Even so, standard deviations, I mean, battle intensity declined by 7 or 8-ish standard deviations, with a massive escalation, but absolutely not related to the disaster.
Did you have a last point?
No, you had the last question I didn't answer on
Mediators, yeah, so we
yes.
can close on that.
So I mean, the best example for that is the 2004 tsunami in Aceh, where there was both from the international but also from the local level, there was a willingness to negotiate, but there was also a lot of resistance by, let's say, more hawkish fractions on both sides. And then the disaster catalyzed the sense of there has been enough suffering in Aceh, so sort of a moral high ground to end the conflict because there's already so much suffering. At the same time, a lot of international pressure on the conflict parties to negotiate or at least de-escalate to allow aid delivery. And mediators really use that. And I mean, both from the conflict parties and internationally, you really use that skillfully to broker the Helsinki peace agreement, which still, I mean, is still valid and works up until today, so pretty successful. It has been used in some other cases, but I generally say mediators don't seem to systematically draw on that.
Great, well, with that, I want to thank Tobias for his talk and for his